The next time you think about stretching your hamstrings, ask yourself, are my hamstrings really tight or are they in fact taut? Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today I'm going to be explaining why you need to stop stretching your hamstrings. But before I start, you guys know the drill. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, ding ding ding. And if you don't want to watch the entire video, I will be including timestamps in the description so you can skip ahead to the section that you want. Now, onto the topic at hand. A lot of people tend to overstretch their hamstrings because they have this false impression that their hamstrings are tight, when in fact they are actually taut. And what happens if you end up stretching a muscle that is taut, you can create further imbalances and create more dysfunction in your body. So what exactly is the difference between a tight muscle and a taut muscle? Well, a tight muscle is essentially a muscle that is in a shortened state, and those are muscles that need to be stretched. Whereas a muscle that is taut is a muscle that is in a lengthened state, and that is a muscle that needs to get strengthened. So one of the things with regard to taut muscles, one of the reasons why taut muscles may feel tight is because of a length tension discrepancy between opposing forces of muscles in the front of the body and muscles in the posterior chain or the back of the body. And one of these postural imbalances with regard to the hamstrings group is going to revolve around your pelvis. When it comes to the pelvis, your hamstrings are going to attach to your ischial tuberosities, which are the little sit bones at the bottom of your pelvis. And what happens is if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, because the hamstrings attach to the ischial tuberosities, they are going to raise the origin point of your hamstrings more superiorly, and this is going to cause tautness in the muscle, which most people will interpret to mean as tight, but that is not the case. If you imagine your pelvis, let's say this is the anterior side, so the front of your pelvis, and this is the posterior side, so the back of your pelvis, your hamstrings are going to attach to your ischial tuberosity. So if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, what happens is the front of your pelvis is going to move inferiorly, so down toward the floor, and then the posterior side of your pelvis, the back side, is going to move anteriorly, so toward the ceiling. So if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, what's going to happen is your ischial tuberosities are going to become elevated. And when they raise superiorly, that is going to give you a false impression that they are tight when they are actually taut. So instead of stretching your hamstrings, what you really need to be doing is strengthening your hamstrings. I have been doing this professionally for over 16 years. And in those 16 years, I have assessed thousands of people. And in my clinical experience, I have found that a vast majority of my cases in my clinical experience have an anterior pelvic tilt. I would say over 80% of all people that I've ever assessed throughout my career have had an anterior pelvic tilt. The amount of people that have a posterior pelvic tilt is going to be very, very rare. And if somebody has a posterior pelvic tilt, this is the type of person where they would actually need to stretch their hamstrings. But if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, you need to be strengthening your hamstrings and you need to be stretching all the muscles in the front. So with regard to the pelvis, let's take a little bit of a look into the anatomy and take a look at which muscles anteriorly tilt the pelvis and which muscles posteriorly tilt the pelvis. When it comes to the muscles that anteriorly tilt the pelvis, I want to break this down into your upper body muscles and your lower body muscles. The upper body muscles that anteriorly tilt the pelvis are going to be the muscles that attach to the pelvis and are located posteriorly to your body, so behind you. And these muscles are going to be your erector spinae group, your latissimus dorsi, and also your QL or your quadratus lumborum. When it comes to your lower body, the lower body muscles that anteriorly tilt the pelvis are going to be the muscles on the anterior side that attach to the pelvis and are below your pelvis. This is going to be muscles like your psoas, your rectus femoris, your sartorius, your tensor fasciae latae or your TFL, and the anterior fibers of your glute minimus and your glute medius, and also your adductor longus and adductor brevis. Those are the muscles that anteriorly tilt the pelvis, and those are the muscles that need to be stretched. Now let's take a look at the muscles that posteriorly tilt the pelvis. When it comes to the upper body, the muscles that posteriorly tilt the pelvis are going to be anterior, which means in the front of the body, and they are going to attach to the pelvis. These are going to be muscles like your rectus abdominis and your internal and external obliques, so all of your abs. And then the muscles that posteriorly tilt the pelvis that are your lower body muscles, these are going to be located posteriorly, so behind your body, and it's going to be muscles like the long head of your biceps femoris, which is one of your hamstring muscles, and also your semimembranosus and your semitendinosus, another two of your hamstring muscles. And then finally, we also have your gluteal muscles, things like your gluteus maximus, that's going to posteriorly tilt the pelvis, and the posterior fibers of your glute minimus and glute medius. And then lastly, we also have your adductor magnus. These are the muscles that posteriorly tilt the pelvis, and these are the muscles that need to be strengthened. So if you do have an issue with dysfunction and you do have an anterior pelvic tilt, you want to stretch the muscles that anteriorly tilt the pelvis, and you want to strengthen the muscles that posteriorly tilt the pelvis. So if you are trying to correct this type of dysfunction, what you would want to do are exercises that involve hip extension. You want to strengthen those muscles. So things like hamstring curls, things like supine hip extensions to strengthen your glutes. Those are the type of activities that you want to incorporate into your program. And there's this great exercise. It's called a 4-point glute series. And one of the reasons why this is a really great exercise is because it targets all the different fibers in the glute max. There are 4 different positions. It's essentially a hip extension, so a supine hip extension that you were doing on the floor. But one of the things is you're playing around with the levels of adduction and abduction and internal and external rotation of the femurs, which is your hip bones. So there are 4 different positions. The first one, you are putting your knees together and your feet apart, and you are going to be performing a hip extension in that position. What you can do for this one is take a business card or take any type of currency, put it between your knees. If that currency drops, then you need to put that, you really need to squeeze together and be able to do that exercise while holding it together if you want to target the most lateral fibers of the glute max. Then the next one would be knees apart, feet apart. This is going to target the lateral fibers, but not the outermost lateral fibers of the glute max. It's going to be the ones closer to the midline. Then if we were to go feet together, knees together, this is going to target the medial fibers, but the ones that are a little bit closer to the middle. And then if you keep your feet together and spread your knees apart as far as you can without letting your navicular bone leave the floor, this is going to target the most medial fibers of the glute max. So you can do those 4 different variations of the hip extension, and that will help to correct the dysfunction of your anterior pelvic tilt. And then with regard to the hamstrings, you can do the same thing with the hamstrings, play around with different positions. So if you are going to do something like a hamstring curl on a machine, you could play around with how exactly your toes are pointing. You could do a set where your toes are pointing straight ahead, one where your toes are curled in, and one where your toes are pointing out. That way you could target the different parts of your hamstrings. You could target your rectus femoris, your semimembranosus, and also your semitendinosus. And then with regard to stretching, an excellent stretch that you can incorporate into your stretching routine would be a myofascial stretch for the psoas. I'm going to include a link right up over here. You can click on that. That is a great stretch. I've used it with many of my patients, and it's really good at helping to correct an anterior pelvic tilt, because your psoas, as I stated earlier, is one of the muscles that is going to cause an anterior pelvic tilt. And if the psoas is really, really tight, again, the ischial tuberosity will raise, which is going to raise the origin point of the hamstring, and this is going to further create dysfunction in your body. Aside from the myofascial stretch of the psoas, another terrific stretch that I give to my patients that have an anterior pelvic tilt is the myofascial stretch of the rectus femoris. I'm going to also include a link of that right over here. So if you do want to correct an anterior pelvic tilt, be sure to check out that. One of the reasons why the rectus femoris is going to cause an anterior pelvic tilt is because of your quadricep muscles. The rectus femoris is the only quadricep muscle that actually crosses the pelvis. So because it crosses the hip, it attaches to the anterior inferior iliac spine. And because it attaches to the anterior inferior iliac spine, what's going to happen is when that muscle gets really, really tight, it's going to pull on the front of your pelvis, which is going to cause that anterior pelvic tilt. So if you end up doing the myofascial stretch of the rectus femoris, those 2 exercises in conjunction with the strengthening of the hamstrings, so the playing around with the different angles of the foot position, and also the strengthening of the glutes with the 4-part glute series, those 4 exercises, those 2 stretches and 2 strengthening exercises are going to be a terrific way that you can alleviate symptoms of tightness in your hamstrings, or what you perceive to be as tightness in your hamstrings, and correct your anterior pelvic tilt. So the next time you think about stretching your hamstrings, ask yourself, are my hamstrings really tight, or are they in fact taut? Because more likely than not, they are going to be taut rather than tight. And if they are taut, you need to strengthen them and stop stretching your hamstrings. But that's pretty much it for today's video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to smash that like button so I know to make more of these types of videos in the future. And if you're either new to the channel or haven't subscribed yet, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, as I will be uploading new videos every single day. That's it for today's video. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you again tomorrow.